Again, I think it has tremendous seduction amongst the middle class. Okay, one shouldn't underestimate the power of growth even now. Yeah, and what is that seduction? The seduction is a life of plenty and a life of abundance. And much of this life of plenty and abundance is also about the spectacle effect, in the sense that you see places like the US, you see places like Europe, and you think this is reproducible, and you naturalize these desires, right? So the seduction I don't underestimate, but these seductions also come with vulnerabilities. The vulnerability of debt, the vulnerability of slowdown, the fact that your life really depends on a touch and go situation vis-a-vis your job on a regular basis. Yeah, so these vulnerabilities, these dangers as it were, I think compels people also to have a sense of doubt about it, right? Much as they are sort of bought into the project, they are also they're beneficiaries and victims. Let me put it this way. Yeah, I have, for example, a very interesting story to tell. Often when I go abroad to talk to audiences as a scholar and as an academic, invariably, of course, the growth story of China and India is something of much interest in various countries in the US. At least it was for 5 years ago. And all of them say, wow, yes, huge markets are going to open up for us and there's going to be immense possibilities. And then I say, yeah, that's all very true. But do you think if we catch up with your lifestyles, there's enough on this planet? And then they pause, knowing fully well that here's a contradiction. That is, if we become like them, they can't be themselves. You see? So the growth story is full of these plots and subplots. Yeah, it's not a one-way street, which is why I would say it's embraced by those who are on top of the game. Those who are on the middle and who are on the edge always have their suspicions and always have their anxieties and fears and dilemmas, which is why the very idea of growth, yeah, is something that will not carry everyone with them in an equal enthusiasm and jest, yeah, right? So, I mean, this would be roughly some sort of reply that I can give you. I am, there's this very classic phrase of saying I'm an optimist. People will figure out solutions, life moves on, civilizations come and go, but the human possibility has sustained itself for quite some time. But within that paradigm, also there's the dystopians. Yeah, what are the biggest anxieties that the dystopians have about the current model? Not of collapse. I don't think collapse is the big problem here, because somehow the other things can work out to stall that. But I think what it will mean, and what it appears to be, to me, the next level at which governments and businesses are moving, is the idea of the security state. The relative notions of democracy that sustained industrial growth, modernization, and democratization, and the welfare state also, if you look at the post-Second World War, that logic is really breaking down. Today, the costs of freedom are tremendously high. Yeah, you have a range of new technologies where we are definitely under surveillance. Yeah, different levels of surveillance. Yeah, for example, take a look at Norway. Very innocent. They have almost phased out paper money. They've got digital money. Now, digital money is at one level enables exchange and buying, another level produces data, metadata, right? So your buying habits, who has spent what, how much you can buy, how much you can consume, this all can be calibrated through all kinds of softwares. And this is something now that is not, it's not Big Brother. It's not only the state. There's a huge collection of private capacities. I might also tell you this, for example, when the Boston bombing happened, the private video surveillance was given by the hotels and the private companies along that stretch. The government was not monitoring. It was private monitoring of that stretch that ultimately led to the catch of whoever it was. Yeah, but there is tons and tons of data out there just waiting to be analyzed, interpreted, and sequenced for all kinds of calculations. Okay, now you take that capacity and you take credit stress and you take scarcity, relative scarcity, and you take the fact that societies now can be hierarchized very easily. It's stunning how quickly, like even if you were to go to the airport, there's a separate section for first class. We accept it. Even when you clear, there's a separate section for first class and diplomats or whatever. The private citizen itself is so sort of, in some ways, distributed into such a range of accepted hierarchies that to me, it seems that one of the great dangers of dealing with climate change or with environmental stress is the fact that you can suspend the quest for democracy under conditions of alarm, anxiety, fear, and insecurity. You can suspend that. So my dilemma really is to see this, there's this possibility of this dark side. The human, I mean, I can't say what's going to happen next year or whatever, but there is this capacity that exists out there to actually overturn democracy, the idea of democracy itself from conventional life. Yeah, and I see that as something that can be part of this trouble about energy deficit, about the economy, about growth itself. In fact, I think, and I said that I think in our talk today, that America is an aristocracy now. And it's not hard to see how the Indian growth story, it will begin to falter because it is debt-based and it is speculative-based and it is based on assets that are overpriced. When it gives way, it doesn't necessarily mean democracy might follow. It could also mean aristocracy, which of course our deep history is far more attuned to handle than democracy. You know, so in that sense, I would say that how the story is unfolding in the future, there's a dark side to it. You know, and it's not simply about technology and economics responding to scarcity. It's actually the reduction of the human quest for freedom. You see, what is very interesting, and this is on the slide detour, is not that the banks got bailed out, but actually there was no revolution that followed. Yeah, or no, I mean, there was criticism and people made noises, but the failure of an alternative imagination was not, I mean, the failure of an alternative imagination to emerge was the problem. That what would your life be without the big banks? So in fact, I would say that what we see today is the steady elimination of alternatives, right? The steady, so it is growth as Tina. There is no alternative. That is more dangerous than growth, you see. And what worries me, which I was also sharing with one of the speakers, is that why we need these alternatives is that in the event that there's a collapse, and urban life as we know it is not possible. If we killed the last person who grew potatoes, what do we do? You see? So it is important that we sustain plural worlds. And that's why I would buy into what Shiv Vishwanathan says, that instead of linear progress, what we need is a synchronization of plural worlds. That is, we learn to coexist with subsistence farmers, slash and burn agriculturalists, nomads, pastoralists, you know, these a kaleidoscope of possibilities. We just sustain them. We don't know, you see, because right now everything seems to be that we are, you know, I use the word final imagination as a sarcasm of final solution. You know, the middle class becomes the final imagination, that we all want to be precisely what they were once and what we have become. So the real crisis is the impossibility to coexist with difference. the impossibility to coexist with the other, right? And so, in the words of a very famous, who was that? Chief Seattle. Apparently, the quote, of course, is suspect. Somebody had written that, but anyway, it's so beautifully done. It's worth quoting. Where he says, "You die from a great loneliness of spirit." Once you've eliminated all the animals on the plains and you've reduced all your diversity. So that is really one of the tragedies of the middle class life. And which is coming back to your question that once the banks were given the money, what could you do? But the white man is still an experiment on that land. Okay, we don't know how it's going to turn out. Yeah, in the long this very Chow Enlai's very famous statement, he was once asked, "What do you think of the French Revolution?" And he said, "It's too early to tell." So yeah, so in some deep civilizations such or deep time societies such as ours, because I don't always use the word civilization necessarily, wait and watch is possible. Casino capitalism, a life on the edge of speculation, the constant production of debt, these look like they are going to collide against what you said, not only physical limits, but the whole question of the energy that built this as a possibility. In fact, I like the fact that, you marked that section, that when the American middle class was being built, it was built on oil abundance and water abundance, both of which China and India do not have that luxury. Okay, so often, when we have demands like 24 hours electricity and 24 hours water, it draws from that imagination. Completely unreal here, right? In fact, it would be more correct for us to say, okay, there's a chunk of time that we don't have electricity, but we are informed of that in advance, so it's more discipline, and you plan accordingly, right? So that is, I think, something that we are getting our modules and our notions. They are being dumped rather than engaged with. I'm sorry, I'm just going to take a second. There's this, I watch a lot of reality TV because I have to teach. So I have to try and tell my students that I'm not that old. So there used to be this reality show called Dare to Date on VH1. It's about, many of these programs on VH1 and MTV are about creating the new individual for consumption. Okay, an individual based on distraction, desires, fashions, and choices. Yeah, so it's in some ways, very radical because the girl and the boy are brought together. Their families are not brought together, and they're asked to date. And then they often say, "Oh, I didn't like this, I didn't like that." Unlike your films, the family is detached, which is a new concept in India. Yeah, not possible maybe 20, 30 years before. And in that, there is always this one romantic dinner in which there's a candlelight and the two have to sit together. So I often joke with my students. I say, candlelight dinner, that means 70% of India is having a romantic evening, because there's no electricity in large parts of India. But you absorb this idea of romantic because it's there in the West, which has, no energy, no electricity shortage the way we have it. But the point I'm trying to make is how you take those ideas, remove their context, and you implement it here somewhat uncaringly, not knowing that you actually end up on the wrong side of that argument or that thinking, so on and so forth. So the whole idea about growth being sustainable, can I put the, because that forces us to make a decision about the future which is not completely possible in one sense. I would rather reframe that question. Say that what is so sustainable about growth? If we debate that question this way, then it doesn't add up. We just, those elements of growth, because growth also has an ideology of material acquisition, addressing the questions of poverty, addressing a deficit, those aspects are also there. So if I was to just reverse it, say what is sustainable about growth, then I could answer that question better, for me at least. Yeah, And what is not sustainable is precisely the casino aspect to it. Yeah, the belief that, you know, if you continue to bet on the future, continue to acquire debts, you speculate on debt, things will somehow improve for everybody. That, I think, is not a sustainable option. Yeah, I mean, you know, one could write off this idea based on all the evidence that we already have. What we can even account for the fact that there is a huge chunk of people who are committed to it, you know, for various vested interests or whatever, including the middle class for all its doubts and anxieties. But the idea of, you know, development was a great destiny to have. Progress was a great destiny to have after independence, right? How did that transform into growth? Yeah. Fundamentally underpinning that is a loss of any perspective on equity and justice. And the fact that our society is willing to accept that is what worries me. It's not simply the growth as a concept, as an idea. It sits atop this fundamental acceptance that we don't have to have a just society. We don't have to have an equal society, because equality is bad for innovators. Justice, you know, is something that may discourage people from standing out and doing different things. Yeah, and moreover, today, this strong individualization of people through economic processes, through various other kinds of incentives, and the breakdown really of the collective in some very fundamental ways, makes the idea of growth something that's not challengeable. But, you know, this very famous writer, I think it was Paul Virillo, he writes that there is no ideology in the world that can defeat Americanism, because it's the only ideology that preaches self-love. Every other ideology on this planet preaches some sort of restraint on the other, right? It is only Americanism that preaches self-love by constantly satisfying yourself no matter what is involved. And that's the way to celebrate yourself. Those kinds of ideas have settled in around the idea of growth. You know, for example, look at ads that say things like, because you deserve it, is on a yacht, yeah? You know, a huge set of ads that actually sell you things because you become someone better off with them, you know? It's individually targeted. And along with that is the inadequacies that creep in when you don't have them, yeah? So I think those are linked to the idea of growth. Those actually is the ambient temperature in which growth happens and takes shape. You know, so it would be only technical to speak of growth as the casino. But you'd need to give more flesh and blood into how the idea of growth settles onto the person and his life. This idea is a far more diabolical idea than one of economics. Okay, that's the underlying message. Like, for example, look at car ads. They're always beautiful cars in incredibly fantastic roads across hills and mountains. You never see stuck in try parking one of those great cars in Mumbai or Delhi. But the point is not that it's stupid and full of contradictions. The point is people accept those contradictions. They buy into that in a very systematic and very careful and thinking way as well. It's not that they don't see those contradictions, but they say, the car is great. You see? So this is a very famous thinker, Guy Debord, French thinker ultimately, and like many French thinkers, they commit suicide at 65. He wrote this book called Society of the Spectacle, in which he talks about how much of image making in our society is actually creating the spectacle. And so the spectacle is that point where the liar lies to himself. You know, so we are a world saturated with symbols and signs that have lost their connection to the real. So we live in a simulated world, what Baudrillard calls simulation, as simulacra. Yeah, so that is, and that would Matrix also, the movie actually deals with that, draws upon that idea that actually our access to reality is highly mediated in such a fashion that the real has, there is no real, it's different shades of unreal that we deal with. Yeah, so in that sense, when you say about growth, we need to see it as having many faces and many sides that sustain each other. So if the stock markets fail tomorrow, what happens to the rational man with animal spirits? He doesn't just go away immediately, right? He will try to re-envision a life precisely along those lines, you know. And advertising is simply because to be a rational man with animal spirits is not natural. It has to be crafted and created by the pushing of the right number of buttons. I would still say this much, is that not the game will end, but once the game ends, what happens? This is what's worrying. Will it be a systematic retreat? Will it be complete utter chaos? Or will they emerge a far more ferocious form of control over people and things than before? You know? So that's the way I'm looking. So my point is, is that it is important for us to discuss it, and it's important for us to constantly push for new alternatives and options. And there's also a way in which the monster somehow, if you poke it, it might get angry or whatever, but maybe out of fatigue or whatever, the monster also will calm down a bit. We don't know. So there's all kinds of options. Yeah, no critique is ever lost. My favorite way of telling this to a lot of my students, because as an academic we are not expected to implement, or none of our actions lead to any consequence, so we are there in that pure imprisoned world of ideas. Yeah, is that in 1756, if you were in, say, eastern the US, and you said something about slavery, and you said, what, all people are equal, nobody would have listened to you. Everyone getting sugar, tobacco and cotton grown on slave labor said, listen, not only are you a minority, you're half mad, so get out of the way. But in 1861, if you said, all people are equal, you've got the numbers with you, right? So it was not that you were wrong, it was just that those ideas were not significant enough to to influence people at that time. But should those ideas have been made? Yes. Have you heard of the Julian Simon and Ehrlich bet?
Yes.
Okay, right. So one of the neoclassical arguments in that is that the resource is not finite, because the notion of resource can keep changing. Yeah. So if it's not oil, we'll fire up something else. Yeah. Okay. So you look at America today; it's got fracking. They pulled out all that natural gas. There's a big debate about the water, but they said they'll clean it up. And they're looking forward to be a net exporter of that resource by 1828. So the Saudis are extremely worried that they will go if the Americans have enough oil. Yeah. So the twists and turns of history are such that the relationship between two variables might not be the same relationship as time unfolds. However, given all that, nevertheless, the basic logic that you pointed out today is something that is very compelling, and that I think I'm very convinced about. Yeah, it's not so much that limits will kill us or destroy us, but how we might not escape the idea of the limit. When Europe was turning in the 19th century, thinkers like Nietzsche and all, they were extremely frightened. One of the things that they said is that you've created modern man. You've removed God. There's no more restraint. Man will depend upon himself. Okay? He will be someone who is expected to do what God is doing. Yeah? And then he said something that was even more frightening. He said, if it's endless knowledge, we will always be inadequate. And we'll always be chasing it. There'll be no limit to what we can arrive at. You see? So a world of limits was actually needed to be human. You see? A lot of economists, they're in the heart of that madness. You can't see. You're blurred. Much as you point out stuff to them, like much of the middle class today, you put them in a room and say, what about growth? They can't think outside of it. If you were to take an indigenous person from a tribe in the Amazon and think of a world without forest, he won't have the language to do that. Same way, if you take away growth right now, and our cars and our CDs and our cell phones, we don't have the language to understand that world. It would be unfair to us not to have anxieties about the dark possibilities. I mean, that's not fair. I mean, if you say, okay, we are in this mess, but things will be better, I think that's not helpful. But you have to say that, listen, there's this potential for it moving in either direction. You shouldn't take it for granted that it's going to be indefinite progress, that we are always going to sit around and improve things. Not necessarily the case, yeah? I would like to restate the need to think of what it is to be human in all such endeavors. For example, all these Sufis that we are so enamored by and proud of, by their love for God and by their music, they made their bodies completely impossible for any exploitation. They neither produced, never gave taxes, and they were completely useless to be deployed for anything else other than what they did. Yeah. So think of a body that's so devoted to a spiritual possibility, that is so useless for an economy, that is so worthless for a sociology, because they're not about society either, but something that actually made possible both economics and the society. So if we don't have a blackboard, we cannot write something on. So it's in that sense that much of our criticism, much of the way we are talking and thinking right now is about keeping alive alternatives.